Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion on climate change and the geopolitics of nuclear power in the Baltic. It's hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics of the University of Cambridge, where we have our Baltic Geopolitical Programme, which Professor Brendan Sims from the Centre, and myself, Charles Clark, lead. I want to thank all our colleagues at the Centre who've made this event possible. This is the 12th in this Baltic Geopolitical Programme series, and the third in a series of what have become regular events on contemporary Baltic challenges. We decided to do this one in light of the COP26 conference in Glasgow, and we tried to think of aspects of that sustainability of energy debate which have particular relevance in the Baltic area. We've had a lot of interest in the programme, and I'm delighted to say that with our colleagues in the network of universities in the region, we are now building a substantial programme of events and activities and a regular newsletter. If you're watching this and you haven't yet done so, please sign up to receive our regular material. About 50 people have registered for this event. As I said earlier, the subject of our webinar today is climate change and the geopolitics of nuclear power in the Baltic. With COP26 coming in November, the geopolitics of nuclear power is an issue of major concern for the UK and for many states in the Baltic Sea region, who are seeking to grow their renewable energy production in an era of increasing geopolitical tension. But the nuclear industry remains a key export sector for both China and Russia within this context of rising geopolitical pressure. So, for example, in recent months, Lithuania has expressed major concerns about the Belarusian Astravets plant, while Poland has announced a major programme of nuclear power plant construction. The UK, meanwhile, has put nuclear power at the heart of its net zero strategy, all the while looking to exclude Chinese firms from current and future nuclear projects. So you can see from that the flow and interplay of nuclear energy and geopolitical issues. Our Baltic Geopolitics Programme has chosen this aspect of the general sustainability debate, since geopolitics is particularly significant in relation to the nuclear energy source, as well as the controversy about the extent to which nuclear energy can be regarded as, in some sense, quotes, green, unquotes. And these are very live political and other issues in the countries around the Baltic Sea. So that's what we're talking about today. I'm delighted to say that our main presentation will be given by Jane Nakano, who's joining us from Washington. And Jane, thank you very much for joining us today. Jane graduated from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and holds a master's degree from Columbia. She worked on energy policy in the US Embassy in Tokyo, and then moved to the Office of Policy and International Affairs in the US Department of Energy, after which she moved to the Center for Strategic and International Studies as Senior Fellow in Energy Security and Climate Change. She frequently writes and speaks on these issues at domestic and international conferences and to media around the world. She has testified before Congress on China's competitiveness in energy technology manufacturing and exports, as well as US liquefied natural gas exports, and also before the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission on US-China nuclear energy cooperation. Jane will make a presentation for 15 to 20 minutes, after which she will answer questions from Hugo Bromley, who you can see on the panel, who I'll introduce in just a second. Jane, as I say, many thanks for joining us, and we look forward to your introduction to this discussion. Jane Nakano.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you so much, Hugo, all of you for having me. So first, I wanted to share with you a map that was put out by the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, that shows you map. Here we go. Yeah, the first slide, please. That shows you basically, this isn't, we won't be going through all the sites, but just to show you that, nuclear, there are roughly, 450 nuclear reactor units in, nuclear power plants in operation around the world. And you can see that they're not necessarily that widespread, unlike, let's say that, coal or other hydrocarbon resources that are used in so many countries, actually most countries on the earth. However, I think given this growing interest in addressing this climate change crisis, it's starting to regain interest among quite a few countries. Also, beyond the countries that already do use nuclear to generate electricity, according to IAEA, there are roughly 30 countries that have never had nuclear in their power portfolio, but are either considering, planning, or already starting to build their first nuclear power plant. And so it's in many ways, even though nuclear is, comes with its own set of sort of challenges and perhaps controversies, it's very much still on the table for many policymakers, particularly those that are looking at energy security and climate change, as well as some of the national security matters. Next slide, please. The next one, it's to show you, so it's not as pretty looking at the IAEA map. This is the table that I came up with. This is just to show you how nuclear, power plant status has been changing around the world for the past 3 years. You see on the first row, construction starts. And then the second one is the new grid connection. The third one is permanent shutdowns. The basic story, again, the idea isn't to go over each, development, but to show you that there are a lot that are being built still. And you notice in parentheses, these are where the reactors are being built, including both construction starts and then new grid connection. You noticed a lot that are being built in China. But in sort of contrast to that, if you could please focus on the permanent shutdown information, there are a lot that are being shut down in the Western, or I should say advanced industrialized countries, such as the United States, but then also Japan. And in the case of Japan, it has a lot to do with the Fukushima nuclear accident that basically led to a lot of operators to forego making very expensive safety adjustment, and then to just choose to just not seek license extension for their nuclear power plants. But you see that that there is definitely two different types of sort of a demographic trends here. The next slide, please. Now I wanted to get much more into the geopolitics side of it. This is basically the same table, except that I highlighted in red reactors that were built that are being built or have been built by the Russians and Chinese. And if you focus on the construction starts, some of these reactors are not in China or Russia, but they're being built with Russian or Chinese technology, such as the Akkuyu in Turkey. Also, there are some, the Akkuyu 1 and 2, and then also, there is the one in Iran, which of course has its own, it probably warrants completely another 60 minutes of presentation discussion. But also, if you look at the grid connection, these are, many are built using Chinese and Russian technologies. And again, I guess the permanent shutdowns, they're predominantly the Western technology reactors that are being shut down. By the way, for those of you that are interested in even sort of a further detail, so if you look at the new grid connection, you know that in 2018, China, so Haiyan 1, Haiyan 2, and also Sanmen and Taishan constructions, but these are both the US and French technologies. For that reason, I did not highlight them in red. Because that still means that these are US and French exports using the Western advanced industrialized country technologies. The next slide, please. Now, here I wanted to focus a little bit more about nuclear export strategy side of it, as opposed to the distribution. And I guess, one of my, the report that Charles kindly referenced is this report that I did last year that looked at the changing geopolitics of nuclear energy. The change comes from a couple of different major developments, but one of them is the relative decline of US nuclear industry. In the United States, we still have 54 nuclear reactors online, still making it the largest nuclear power generation fleet in the world, supplying about 20% of electricity in the United States. But it's now the past couple months, things are starting to look a little different. But generally, since the shale revolution, so-called shale revolution, the US nuclear operators are faced with more abundant natural gas supply at the relatively low prices, but then also ever cheaper renewable power sources. And so for some of the nuclear power plants in the United States, the decision has been made to actually have premature retirement rather than to really let the nuclear power plant run for the initial roughly 40-year period, which would have been unthinkable of 20, 30 years ago. Generally, once the capital investment may be huge for nuclear, but once you start operating, it's quite stable. It becomes a lot lower than some of the other power sources that are much more subject to marketplace volatilities and fuel prices, also seasonal volatility, such as natural gas. But since 2013 in the United States, at least 10 reactors have permanently shut down, and we're expecting several additional closures through the middle of this year, middle of this decade. And the situation has been only exacerbated with the construction delay. Currently, there's only one project that's being built, hosting 2 reactors, but that's this project is in Georgia. Just a couple of weeks ago, the company announced that the construction finish will be further delayed. But anyway, so things are looking pretty tough in the United States. But but it's at the same time, this relatively decline is happening at the time that both the Russians and Chinese are really putting more resources and also, I guess, both really focus in exporting nuclear power technologies and also services, associated services. In Russia's case, Russian nuclear industry suffered a serious reputational setback following the Chernobyl accident in 1986, but has managed this remarkable comeback in the last decade. So an existing Russian fleet isn't that big, as you can tell from this table, but it's the leading exporter of nuclear technologies right at the moment. There are roughly 50 reactors that are being constructed around the world, and at least 1/5 are Russian, including places like Bangladesh and Turkey. And especially since the inception of Rosatom in 2007, the pace has picked up. Also, China is actually, there's a lot of a focus on Western media about Chinese nuclear, commercial nuclear. frankly, it doesn't yet have an export track record to speak of. The only place that Chinese have built completed nuclear power plants is Pakistan. However, China, the domestic fleet, nuclear power generation fleet itself has been expanding quite quickly, despite the short slowdown following the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan in 2011. Right at the moment, China has 51 reactor units, although it may have changed in the last week or two. Never know, it's been expanding so quickly. But the basic point is, well, in the last 10 years or so, China brought 35 reactor units online at home. So, they built roughly 3 to 4 reactor units per year. And the current Chinese plan is to increase its fleet to, as much as 200 gigawatt by 2035, which basically means that the size of Chinese nuclear power fleet, obviously the nuclear power generation fleet, could take over that of France, which is currently the second largest in the next couple of years, and also take over the US installed nuclear power generation capacity in another a little over 5 years or so. So it's really expanding quickly. It really then, what that means is that it's, because with the constant order and constant construction, it is building much stronger base for cost competitiveness of its components, but then also expertise. They actually have more and more people that are working on the projects and being able to really deliver these projects on time and under budget. Although, of course, in the overseas, regulatory environment is usually different. So what we see in China domestically may not really apply directly to their potential performance overseas. But at the same time, certainly the domestic expansion is likely a strong factor that could favor the Chinese global expansion. The next slide, please. Here it's a little more about the finances. I think the main thing is the U.S. Unlike many other Western, the U.S. and many other Western exporters, such as France and Japan and to some extent Korea, have obviously a degree of state support, but often private companies are very much on the forefront of these export deal-making efforts, etc. Obviously it comes in a range. I think the U.S. is much more so than perhaps, for example, France. But when it comes to Russia and China, it's not just that there is a strong government support. There's also included in that strong government support is this generous financing. This is a table that my colleagues and I came up with that basically shows you the type of places that the Russians and Chinese are trying to provide financing to. Many of these countries, well, obviously UK is exception. UK and probably Finland, I believe, on this table, but many of these countries that are interested in nuclear power plant power projects do not really have strong credit ratings to really allow them much easier access to capital than the ones that are already having nuclear projects, particularly in the advanced industrialized countries. What's happening in recent years is that the Chinese and Russians are starting to combine the generous financing together with adequate technologies to really make it easier for especially some of the the newcomer countries to really enter the nuclear market. What I'm saying is that in the past, the U.S. or UK, other advanced industrialized country nuclear exporters, often were the clear choice for some of the new market entrants, given the safety record and also given the expertise, the exchange of capacity building, etc. However, and also, of course, given the technology was often the biggest deal maker. But in recent years, both the Chinese and Russian technologies are becoming fairly adequate, decent, and when they're combined with generous financing, it just they're starting to really beat out Western competitors, and so that's what this table is about. And since I'm starting to run out of time, let me move to the final slide, please. And here I wanted to discuss some of the key implications of this growing nuclear exports by Russia and China. First and foremost, there are safety and non-proliferation related concerns that are associated with their rise. And I want to be very careful about this, because I don't think Rosatom of any of these Chinese national nuclear companies are interested in proliferating, or they're not interested in some nuclear accident that would happen at a reactor that they export. It's not good for their business. Having said that, I think even in the West, it's not just the regulatory framework, it's not just the technical expertise, but often things like whistleblower culture. Can you really challenge the authority? The existence of robust civil society, I think, is an important factor, important contributor to some of these safety and particularly safety side, operational safety, governance, governing environment. And we can certainly talk a little more about that. But given that I guess today's focus is much more on energy security and geopolitics, I wanted to just spend a little more time on the last two bullets, which is to say, so that there's this, nuclear power plants are a type of critical infrastructure in most countries, just like things like telecom and many other key infrastructure that's really foundation of people's life. And I think there is a lot more security question that really comes with the rise of Russia and China. As I mentioned, Pakistan is the only country that has, imported, although I think some may argue that it's much more of a foreign aid case. It just wasn't really necessarily commercially viable Chinese export to Pakistan. But Pakistan is the only country that's been building. But as many of you, particularly this audience, know, that China is also hoping to build a Hwadong-1 reactor at Bradwell site in the United Kingdom. And it's already going through UK nuclear regulators assessment process. And it's, while it is really important part of the UK government's climate pledge, the fact, the security efficacy of welcoming Chinese technology, I think, is something that really warrants close scrutiny. Obviously, the during the David Cameron cabinet, this deal by China to work closely with EDF of France was welcome, and but several cabinets later, I think the UK-China relations have soured following. Well, I shouldn't know what there. I think multiple causes, but certainly the scrutiny over the nuclear deal has heightened following the Boris Johnson cabinet's decision to phase out Huawei's 5G technologies from the UK telecom network. So it's, and I think Chinese interest in also investing a lot of power grid projects in Western Europe, but then also in places like Australia, is starting to get a pushback, and it has a lot to do with intellectual property theft concern, but then also has a lot to do with I think cybersecurity concern that's starting to grow among Western policymakers and intelligence community. And the last, the geopolitical influences. Let me actually, even though. Let me come back to sort of a UK and then Europe angle, but still Europe. I think the prime example of how there's this geopolitical concern is, well, one, nuclear deal is a multi-decadal deal. In other words, you spend several years negotiating, but then you spend many years constructing, but then there's also maintenance relationship, fuel provision. So nuclear brings together both the technology exporter, and market countries quite closely. But then also there are some questions or some concerns, such as what we're starting to see with the Russian project in Turkey, which takes the form of build, own, operate. Meaning that Russia will build a plant for Turkey, but then also own and operate those plants for Turkey, because Turkey has not had nuclear power plant experience. And for financial reason too, that was a way for Russia to be able to secure this contract from Turkey. But what's significant about this deal is that because Turkey is a member of NATO, it's a North Atlantic Treaty Organization member country, it sort of complicates or raises a lot of questions associated with NATO obligation, member state obligations. For example, in the event that this Russian-owned critical infrastructure, Akkuyu nuclear power plant, gets attacked on a Turkey soil, are they to come to, to protect it? Or what if even, moreover, what if Russia decides to deploy its troops to protect its asset, because it is a Russian asset on Turkey. There are multiple questions, and it's something that's extremely, I think, complicated, extremely sort of high stakes security questions. And I just wanted to end on a note that, to me, what's quite interesting is, given the more recent NATO articulation of concern over China's growing influence, perhaps through cyber or new technology competition in Europe. I do wonder what sort of security and geopolitical implications may arise if China proceeds or China lands nuclear power project in not just in UK, but on any of the NATO member country soil, and then certainly places where perhaps the domestic political situation is rather volatile. But there's just so much still to unpack, but let me just stop there, and I look forward to questions. Thank you so much.
Well, Jane, thank you very much for that tremendous presentation. You've taken us through the range of issues which really we need to think about. The structure we decided to have this afternoon was firstly to ask Hugo Bromley to ask 2 or 3 questions and then go to the audience. I'm glad to say we've already got questions coming in from the audience, one from Sir Andrew Cook, who knows a great deal about this, and I'll come to his question in just a moment. But firstly, let me just introduce Hugo Bromley for 2 or 3 questions. Hugo is a research assistant at the Centre for Geopolitics. After a BA in International History at LSE, he did his MPhil on British trading companies in the Baltic in the 17th and 18th centuries, and is now doing a PhD on protectionism in the 17th and 18th century Britain. He's been very actively involved in the Baltic programme since the outset. So over to Hugo for a couple of questions, and then I'll open it out to the whole of the participants.
Thank you, Charles. And I'm going to keep this extremely brief because we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, which is fantastic. But I'd just like to draw out some of the implications of this for the Baltic Sea region, beginning with the confrontation we've seen recently, and in fact, recent years, it dates back a while, between Lithuania and Belarus over the Astravets plant. And what we've seen there is Lithuania stop energy imports from Belarus over nuclear safety concerns around the plant itself. I was wondering whether you think that is a sensible approach to some of the issues you've outlined and you've suggested in your talk, actually, and regardless whether you think it's going to become increasingly common as we enter this world of increasing polarization and increasing geopolitical confrontation.
Yeah, thank you, Hugo. That's a very interesting, it's an important question, but it's also a really interesting case that I've been following. And from what I understand, I think the Belarusian authority has invited IAEA delegation and also European nuclear regulators group to come look at the site. And if I'm not mistaken, there are half dozen issues that came to their attention, and they're constantly sort of focused on several different things. And whether it's sensible to monitor the level of power import. I mean, in the current sort of a high energy price situation, probably makes it economically less sensible. But that doesn't mean that it's not politically still a sensible thing to do. But I think from a technical perspective, I think Lithuania has every right to want to have more transparency from countries, and from to the extent that I'm aware of, I think Belarus seems to be trying its best to engage third-party international organizations to be able to satisfy neighboring countries' concerns. So it's obviously, it's better than just, keeping silent, keeping quiet. But, again, nuclear has, the type of advantages that a fossil fuels cannot deliver. I mean, there's no, perfect, energy source anyways, but in that sense, having this, power import option, even if Lithuania feels, and then that it's not something that they want to do. Situations may change, things may improve, and it might become much more of a sensible, politically sensible option. But it's a little hard to be honest with you, tell, because I'm not sure exactly, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, some of these, what happens with the external power supply outage, and I think the other thing that the European regulators are trying to get better clarity are, it's fairly important and serious issues. So, obviously, there's no shortcut.
Thank you, Jane. If you don't mind, Hugo, I think I'm going to go to a couple of the participants' questions, and I'll come back to you depending how we go. And let me just say, in terms of participants, we're glad at this event that we've got 1 or 2 participants from the Cambridge Nuclear Energy Centre, and I hope that you who are on the call will answer questions on this with your level of expertise, and we very much look forward to hearing that. The question from Sir Andrew Cook, and I'll just read it. Public opinion is unimportant in Russia and China, but it is in the Western democracies where it's been unfairly influenced, says Andrew, by Chernobyl, which he categorizes as reckless mismanagement of a failed, dangerous Soviet design, and Fukushima, which he categorizes incorrectly called a nuclear accident, but was actually a seismic accident, he says. Why don't Western politicians tell the truth to their electorates? That's to say, if you want the lights to stay on and your electric cars to run and you don't like fossil fuels, then nuclear and hydro in the mountainous regions are the only answers, he asks. Why is there not an openness about this debate?
Thank you for the excellent question. I agree that there is still a lot of, I think, hesitation among elected officials to really more clearly highlight the merit of using nuclear. Obviously, the footprint is much smaller than citing, wind power, and then it's not to say that it shouldn't be really either or discussion. To be honest with you, I think highly electrified system that we are seeking, in the context of climate mitigation, I think, could really use, so many, both renewables, like variable renewables as well as nuclear. But just to be, I think my sense, by the way, about, China and Russia is that I think, the Chinese public and Russian public have much more limited channel to express their views. However, it has been quite interesting to see how the Chinese public, especially those in inland, are quite hesitant to have to host nuclear power plants, and they are, there are ways that they express their disapproval of what the local government officials are trying to do. Also, in Russia's case, on the spent fuel take back issue, several years ago, there was greater momentum for Russia to really actively throw in this, fuel take back deal in the export to be able to, and particularly to the former USSR, friends and family type of deal, but. And I think that there was a citizen group that really tried to push back on that. The basic idea was they did not want to become sort of in their words, sort of a dumpster of radioactive dumpster for a lot of countries. But yes, I mean, I agree. It's and it's, but I think I'm starting to sense the shift even in the United States, where traditionally the Democratic Party's White Houses have been much more reserved on the role that the nuclear may play in climate mitigation. I think the Biden administration has been much more clear about how they see potential contribution of nuclear. It's the sense of urgency that's, I think, starting to have Western policymakers speak up a little more than before. But I do agree with the question that, unfortunately, this, low probability, high risk event is just something that most elected officials, if possible, would like to avoid, selling to the voter, unfortunately.
Jane, thank you for that. I think the question and then your answer have highlighted the highly political, with a small p, element of this whole discussion and how one structures a public debate. And so we've had an interesting question from Finland, and Finland featured on your slide earlier on as a place where nuclear power is being developed in cooperation with Russia. Risto Pentila asks, could civilian nuclear power be a source of cooperation rather than conflict between Russia, China, and the West? Is that a hopelessly idealistic view, or could it happen like that? And perhaps I could just add a corollary to that, which is to what extent are Russia, China, and for that matter the US, driven by geopolitical as opposed to commercial considerations? Do they have a strategy for this based on geopolitics, or is it just commerce? Do we know if they have a strategy, what that strategy is? So is cooperation rather than conflict a possibility in this area? And what are the strategic goals of these major nuclear energy exporters?
Yeah, thank you for another excellent question. I think, so I used to focus a little more on nuclear cooperation between the United States and China. Because, nuclear, if the idea, it is a zero carbon emitting source of electricity, and there are also a lot of technical expertise that could be shared. But I think in the recent years, I'm sensing that it's increasingly sort of source of more of a tension than really cooperation. But at the same time, I think, if we look at what's happening at places like International Atomic Energy Agency, there is a forum for regulators from all these countries that really, and also and I think there are also working groups looking at specific technologies where regulators do cooperate and share lessons learned. What's really interesting, by the way, in recent years is that because China ended up building and completing Westinghouse AP1000 reactor ahead of the US, from what I've heard from some of the industry sources, is that there is quite a bit that the US regulators are learning from the Chinese regulators about how some features that may be unique to AP1000. So these things, to some extent, I think at a certain level, I think cooperation will continue. The flow of information, or whether the arrow are the same size, or who benefits more from what which partner. That may change, but I think there is element of cooperation, but at the same time, I think it's increasingly strategic. As far as sort of Russia and China's relationship in nuclear commerce goes, up until today, it's been sort of a divide and conquer, if you will. I think generally China hasn't really, China does not seem to have aggressively gone after markets that the Russia, has been, already in the process of cornering, if you will. However, I think, that may be fast changing in the coming years. And also my sense, reviewing literature, but then also having some interviews with some Russian experts, is that Russia is very much aware of the technical competence of Chinese nuclear manufacturers, and also the cost, cost competitiveness, and clearly Chinese economy GDP is so much bigger than Russia, and in Russia's case, often nuclear, has been helped by what Russia is getting from oil gas export revenue. In China's case, I think, and to some extent that makes it interesting that in that Russia doesn't have that many commodities and certainly high-tech stuff to offer to the world to get its economy going. Other, and weapon system and nuclear power plants are the two main categories, whereas China has so many other things that are that they can export. So in that sense, I think you all have a lot to do with how their internal economic or the industrial priorities may evolve from now on. It's not just where they might be able to sell, but the priority within China could be much more dynamic than that within the Russian system or the Russian menu of Russian exports. So
thank you very much for that, Jane. I'm now going to take a question from Tony Ralston, who Tony, it's very nice to come across you again. We're undergraduates together, last saw each other decades ago, but very nice that you're on this call. From the Cambridge Nuclear Energy Centre. And he says, one of the key advantages of China and Russia, which you highlighted on your slide, whether building at home or for export is government finance. You showed that on your slide earlier on. If countries in the West, asked Sony, want to restart building nuclear, how will they be financed, given that no nuclear plant has been financed privately, but all Western energy investment is wholly or largely private? So he's highlighting the finance disparity between China and Russia on the one hand and the West on the other.
Yes, yeah, that's another really great question, an important question. Thank you. It's been really hard. I mean, UK has been trying to, also, figure out how to get, other countries engaged, such as, some of the Japanese companies. And in the US, we're really trying to figure out how to structure and also address both the operator side concern, but then also investor side concern. But one of the, it's not going to be low hanging fruit, but one of the immediate things that comes to my mind is, in one way or another, I think we really need to take a close look at how the OECD export credit structure continues to disadvantage advanced industrialized countries. That is to say, both Russia and China are not members of OECD. Therefore, they're not bound. Their export credit agencies and government financial institutions are not bound by the type of rules that they have on the member countries' export credit agencies. So often the terms of these loans are much more generous, like longer return, higher, lower rates. And it's just really hard for OECD member economies to compete. And that's, I guess, I'm sorry, maybe much more about export side as opposed to domestic side. I hope I got the question right. But I mean, at least that's some, institutional one. And if we look at China, of course, on a per capita basis, it's still a developing country, but as a whole, it's the second largest economy. So there's a lot of I guess, adjustment or updating that we really need to do. That's my opinion. But I think sometimes it just, it's not, especially when it comes to nuclear. That's one of the most obvious areas that warrants, I guess, Western policymakers, especially, the Western policymakers from the countries that do have nuclear expertise and industry, as opposed to Western countries that are generally opposed to nuclear, and they tend to probably not want to touch it. But yes, OECD system warrants closer attention.
Thank you, Jane. Now, in one of your earlier answers, you raised the question of nuclear waste and how that was dealt with. And Narman Habtom asked the question, has nuclear waste management kept pace with the expansion, advancement and export of nuclear energy? I think he's trying to touch there on the public concerns issues that actually, if you go ahead with nuclear strongly, there's public doubt as to whether nuclear waste can be properly and safely managed.
No, thank you for another, important question. It's a really tricky one. I think in my view, it's not a technical question. I think it's more of a political will. Countries like Sweden have been looking at, are farther along, but in most other countries, like the United States, it's simply something that it's hard to cite, and it's really just hard to have the political will to have concrete, viable, permanent high waste, high radioactive waste waste site management site. When it comes to export, I think it is a little different. Because then there are a lot more of a sort of security and non-proliferation concerns. But that's precisely what institutions like IAEA is set out to help address. But I think for that reason, exporters such as Russia and also to some extent France are attractive to countries that do not want to deal with used fuel management headache, if you will, because it's not just the site that you need. You also need to come up with the regulatory framework, and obviously, siting is expensive, and also there's a lot of political, the domestic public acceptance challenge. But you're right. I think that's another reason why in the Western economies or democratic economies, it's so much harder to just simply, highlight the benefits of nuclear and then start citing them. Yes, yeah, but again, I think it's more of a political issue than really technical issue, in my view.
Okay, thank you. I promised Hugo I'd go back to him. There was questions coming in, so I cut him off earlier on. So Hugo, the floor is yours for another question.
Thank you. I'll keep it very brief. And actually, it's been brought up momentarily already, but I just want to hear more of your thoughts on it, which is the relationship in Russia between oil and gas exports and Rosatom, who of course heavily rely, we assume, and we know to an extent, on state funding. And you've postulated before in your research that is inevitably going to be closely linked to Russia's own fossil fuel exports. How do you see that relationship shifting in the coming years? We've obviously seen some of those. The Russian goal is to reduce those state subsidies, but how do you see that relationship shifting, and how do you see those two markets interacting in Russian energy exports?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. I think there is a clear linkage between, well, let me sort of step back a little bit. I think in the case of Russia or China, but let me focus on Russia. Often, the sale of a nuclear reactor itself is not necessarily an obvious commercial case. It's often the fuel provision, maintenance service, so you need to look at it as a package deal. Unlike in Western countries where, individual company, working in each segment of the value chains needs to make money and then, answer to their shareholders. In Russia's case, it's more about, it's a state business. And in many cases, Rosatom is a state entity, and not just strategy. The view is that nuclear industry is important to really maintain nuclear expertise, well, so long as Russia is a weapons state. But then also it's to sustain the technical innovation, research and innovation base. It's something that is worth supporting, even if it's not commercially sort of self-reliant, if you will. But Russia continues to be a major natural gas exporter, and also it's even in this this move away from much more of a fossil fuel dominant, I guess even under this energy transition, of course, oil gas revenues. I don't think it's something that Russia knows is an important engine of its economy, but what some of the things I don't yet understand are, one, I've seen some, I guess directives that the Russian state is trying to wean Rosatom of really heavy subsidy, and that has been postponed. I think the deadline has been postponed multiple times, if I'm not mistaken. Certainly once in the major, the deadline for stopping or basically drastically reducing subsidy was a couple of years ago. Unless I'm out of date, that has not yet happened. And for a while, I think maybe this growing competition with other natural gas exporters, such as U.S. and perhaps Australia, as well as Qatar. Maybe the idea was to really make Russian nuclear industry to be little tougher, not to be too dependent, and to try to be much more sustainable. And by the way, Rosatom is starting to get much more into renewable energy business as well. But anyways, in the current, I think for quite a while, I do think that gas and oil remain to be an important source of revenue for Russia. And again, I think that link will stay intact for some time to come, especially because I think, especially if China becomes much more of a, viable competitor, as I think Russians are starting to expect already, then on the basis of generous financing, I'm not so sure if Russia has many other places to turn to be able to come up with the type of package that could compete or outcompete what China may be able to offer.
Almost the final question, possibly the penultimate question from Tony Ralston again, follows directly, Jane, on what you've just been talking about. He says, what does the treatment of Ukraine nuclear power plants by Russia say about the controls that come with imports of Russian reactors? And then referring that for a country like Turkey that you mentioned in your slide, or Finland that you mentioned in your slide, that are building their reactors, or South Africa and Jordan that are or were contemplating buying Russian reactors. So what confidence can these countries have in Russian controls of the reactors that they build or supply?
Yes, really good, tough question. Looking at what happened in Ukraine, I think that's something that a country should watch very closely and realize that this is a long-term business. Very recently, the U.S., I believe it was Westinghouse, basically came up with a deal, struck a deal with Ukraine to try to finish what Russia ended up not completing, but then also building new U.S. designed reactors in Ukraine. Again, and by the way, so it's not, even if in this case maybe Russia, but even if the original builder walks away from the plant, there are ways that you can still save the sunk investment, if you will. Although I think past a certain point, it becomes much more expensive to turn around a lot of different both primary and secondary configuration of components and such for the plant. But it's doable. At the same time, yes, there is a risk, in any geopolitical tension, geopolitical situation, there's a chance that Russia can walk away. But I have to note that, when we look at Turkey, which, despite the difference over Syria, the two leaders decided to keep the Akkuyu project on the path to towards completion. Again, it really depends. I think it's a little hard to generalize, but I would definitely, if I were a country that's hosting a Russian nuclear project, I definitely consider what this may mean for geopolitical balance, as well as perhaps, with the viability of, energy, the project from much more electricity provision project as well for my people, for the citizens. And but yes, that's a real world concern.
I'm sorry.
That's a really tricky question.
A lot of really tricky questions today. I'm sorry, we've come to the end of our time, and I apologize to the couple of people who've asked questions, which I can't get around to putting to Jane. It's been a tremendous session, Jane. You've really given us a great deal to think about, and also thank the people who've asked questions, because I think we've had some pretty interesting questions that have come in as well. Really appreciate the time you've given, appreciate the audience joining us for this session. I can say on behalf of the Centre, we're going to think about these types of questions a lot more, the energy security relationship, and we'll think how to take that forward specifically in the Baltic context. But as I say, that's the end of today's video panel. Thanks to everybody, but particularly to Jane for the effort she has put in. And I want to remind you that you'll soon be able to find a recording of this event if you want to go back to it, and particularly to see those excellent slides on the Centre for Geopolitics website. Please do sign up to receive regular information. Good evening, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Hugo.